To the outside world, Lance Mason seemed like a man who had done everything right. A graduate of prestigious institutions, including the University of Michigan Law School, Mason had climbed steadily through the ranks of political and judicial power in Ohio. He served as a state representative, then a state senator, and eventually was appointed to the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas, a position that carried significant prestige. He was articulate, well-dressed, well-connected, and spoke often about justice, community, and fairness. Many in his social and professional circles saw him as a role model, a Black man who had broken through systemic barriers and made a name for himself in the world of law and politics. But behind this carefully cultivated image was a different story, one of control, manipulation, and hidden violence. That reality became shockingly visible on August 2nd, 2014. On that summer day, the truth about Lance Mason's private life exploded into public consciousness in a way that could not be spun or excused. Mason, while driving with his wife, Aisha Fraser, and their 2 young daughters in the car, launched a sudden and brutal assault against her. He punched Aisha at least 20 times in the face with a closed fist, bit her, and slammed her head against the car's dashboard, armrest, and window. He ripped out chunks of her hair with such force that pieces of her scalp remained lodged under his fingernails. Their children sat in the back seat, watching in helpless terror as their father attacked their mother. Aisha was left with a fractured orbital bone, significant facial injuries, and deep emotional trauma. After the attack, she fled the vehicle and ran, barefoot and bloodied, to a nearby home where the residents called 911. She begged for help, terrified, disoriented, and desperate to protect herself and her daughters from the man who had sworn to love and protect her. When police arrested Lance Mason later that day, the full extent of the danger he posed became even clearer. A search of the home he shared with Aisha revealed a disturbing arsenal: multiple semi-automatic rifles, shotguns, handguns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, smoke grenades, a bulletproof vest, and a sword. This was not simply a case of a man snapping in a moment of rage. The stockpile suggested paranoia, planning, and a dangerous inclination toward violence and power. It raised chilling questions. What had he been preparing for? Had Aisha lived for years in fear of not just his fists, but of something far more catastrophic? The 2014 incident, though deeply horrifying, was not an isolated moment. Those who knew the couple later spoke of Mason's controlling behavior, the isolation, the emotional manipulation, the slow erosion of Aisha's confidence and independence. Like so many survivors of domestic violence, Aisha had endured far more than the world ever saw. Her marriage, once a private matter, was now revealed as a nightmare built on fear and survival. Yet even as the brutality of the assault made headlines, some people still struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the crime he had committed. This dissonance would play a major role in how Mason was treated by the legal system and his political allies in the months that followed. Judges, politicians, and former colleagues would write character letters on his behalf, asking the court for leniency, clinging to the image of the man they thought he was, rather than facing the reality of who he had shown himself to be. This first public exposure of Mason's violence should have marked a turning point, a moment where the legal system, the community, and those in power stood firmly on the side of Aisha and her children. But instead, it was treated by many as a momentary lapse by a respected man. That failure to truly see the danger Mason posed, to acknowledge the full weight of his violence, would set the stage for an even more devastating tragedy in the years to come. The brutal 2014 assault on Aisha Fraser by her then-husband, Lance Mason, was not a gray area. It was not a matter of interpretation or a private domestic dispute that left room for doubt. It was a vicious, prolonged act of violence witnessed by the couple's 2 young daughters, documented by medical records, and followed by the discovery of a disturbing stockpile of weapons in Mason's home. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, the justice system, designed, in theory, to protect victims and ensure accountability, responded not with outrage, but with caution, deference, and ultimately, leniency. Lance Mason was indicted and pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including felonious assault and domestic violence. In any other case involving a less connected man, such an attack, particularly one witnessed by children and followed by such an ominous weapons cache, would likely have resulted in a lengthy prison sentence, a restriction on parental rights, and a thorough examination of the abuser's mental state. But Mason was not just any man. He was a former state senator, a sitting judge, and a pillar of Cleveland's legal and political establishment. When sentencing time arrived, the courtroom was filled not with firm condemnation, but with pleas for mercy. Letters poured in from colleagues, political allies, and even friends in high places. Among them was a letter from Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, who praised Mason as someone of strong character who had made a regrettable mistake. She implored the court to consider the totality of his life, his education, service, and achievements, as if these accomplishments should somehow eclipse the monstrous violence he inflicted on the woman he married. The message was clear. Lance Mason was too important to fall completely. Too successful. Too smart. Too well-connected. And so, despite the traumatic assault and the looming threat signaled by his arsenal of weapons, Mason was sentenced to just 2 years in prison. He served only 9 months before being released early. The leniency didn't stop there. Upon his release in 2016, Mason was allowed to regain a level of societal and familial normalcy that would have been unthinkable for most convicted abusers. He was not permanently stripped of his parental rights. He was not subjected to long-term restrictions meant to safeguard Aisha. In fact, he was granted visitation rights with his daughters, a decision that deeply unnerved those close to Aisha, including her friends and family, who feared that he remained a very real danger to her and to the children. And yet, the system acted as though the danger had passed. There was no ongoing intervention, no sustained monitoring, and seemingly no recognition that domestic violence is rarely a one-time incident. It is a pattern, deeply ingrained and often escalating. But the court treated Mason's actions as if they were a fluke, a singular, unfortunate deviation from an otherwise respectable life. His past positions of authority and political prominence insulated him from the full consequences of his actions. Even more disturbing, after his release from prison, Mason found his way back into public service. In 2017, the mayor of Cleveland, Frank Jackson, hired him as the city's director of minority business development, a 6-figure government job. This decision shocked many and sent a chilling signal to survivors of domestic violence everywhere. Even when abusers are caught, convicted, and jailed, the world often opens its arms to welcome them back, while their victims remain haunted, vulnerable, and forgotten. For Aisha, this wasn't just a betrayal. It was a sentence. She was left to rebuild her life, not only as a single mother, not only as a survivor of domestic violence, but as a woman forced to coexist in a system that had repeatedly chosen her abuser over her. Every supervised visit between Mason and the children kept his presence tethered to her world. Every professional rehabilitation Mason received reinforced the idea that his image mattered more than her safety. There was no restraining order that could erase the emotional scars of being attacked in front of her children. No short prison sentence that could restore the sense of security she once had in her own home. The justice system, bound by precedent and poisoned by proximity to power, had given Mason a second chance. But it had given Aisha nothing more than a warning, and ultimately, it failed to protect her from the tragedy that would come. The murder of Aisha Fraser on November 17, 2018, was not just a horrific act of domestic violence. It was a devastating and avoidable tragedy that laid bare the consequences of systemic failure and societal indifference toward escalating abuse. It was the culmination of years of red flags, ignored warnings, and a justice system that had consistently chosen leniency over accountability. Aisha's death marked the final, brutal chapter in a story where the danger was evident all along, yet no one acted decisively enough to stop it. On that November morning, Aisha Fraser, a beloved elementary school teacher and mother of 2, went to Lance Mason's sister's home in Shaker Heights, Ohio. It was part of a routine custody arrangement that had become increasingly tense and fraught over time. Despite their past and Mason's violent history, Aisha had no choice but to maintain some level of contact with him because of shared custody of their daughters. On this day, she had brought the girls to see their father, unaware that Mason was preparing for a final, violent confrontation. What happened next was both chilling and deliberate. As Aisha was either dropping off or picking up their children, Mason emerged and launched a vicious attack. Without warning, he stabbed Aisha multiple times in a sustained and frenzied assault. The violence of the attack was so severe that it shocked even seasoned investigators. This was not a moment of rage or a spontaneous act of passion. It was targeted, intentional, and it occurred in broad daylight, with their children nearby, once again forcing them to witness the unimaginable violence of their father toward their mother. After the stabbing, Mason didn't stay. Instead, he jumped into Aisha's SUV and tried to flee the scene. In his attempt to escape, he crashed into a police cruiser, injuring a police officer. This reckless, desperate act underscored the dangerous chaos that Mason had unleashed, not only upon Aisha and their family, but now on the wider community. The officer was seriously hurt, and the crash brought even more attention to what was unfolding, a highly public unraveling of a former judge who had once stood in judgment over others. When the police finally apprehended him, they discovered Mason covered in blood, both his own and Aisha's. The attack and crash marked the culmination of a downward spiral that had long been visible to those paying attention, a path that started years earlier with controlling behavior, followed by emotional abuse, and ultimately escalated to physical violence in 2014. That earlier attack had left Aisha with severe injuries, including a broken orbital bone, and had exposed the extent of Mason's rage. Yet despite that brutal incident, he had only served 9 months in jail and had been permitted to continue co-parenting, creating a dangerously close proximity to his victim. What made Aisha's murder even more tragic was that many people, friends, colleagues, even some within the justice system, had feared something like this might happen. Her family had worried for her safety. Advocates against domestic violence had spoken out after the 2014 incident, warning that Mason's punishment was too light and that it sent the wrong message about the seriousness of his actions. The arsenal of weapons found in his home after the assault, along with his violent conduct, should have triggered a more thorough intervention. Yet the legal and political systems had chosen to treat him with a kind of privilege rarely afforded to other domestic abusers. He was, after all, a former judge, a former state senator, a man with powerful friends. The result was that Mason was never truly removed from Aisha's orbit. Though a restraining order was initially put in place, it did not prevent contact related to their children, and Mason was eventually allowed supervised visits. Over time, the barriers separating them weakened, and so did Aisha's safety. Her death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a systemic failure, the devastating outcome of a society that often fails to take domestic violence seriously enough, especially when the perpetrator is male, powerful, or respected. Mason had shown who he was years earlier. The warning signs were glaring. Yet rather than isolate and rehabilitate him, the system allowed him to resume life with limited consequences, keeping him in the lives of the very people he had traumatized. Aisha Fraser's murder ignited widespread outrage, especially in Cleveland and among advocates for victims of domestic violence. Her story became a heartbreaking case study in what happens when the justice system fails to recognize the lethality of abusers. Her death galvanized renewed conversations about the need for stronger protections for survivors, more robust penalties for abusers, and a greater willingness to believe women when they say they are afraid. But for Aisha, those changes would come too late. She had done everything she could to protect herself and her children, pressing charges, pursuing legal remedies, following the custody agreements. Still, it wasn't enough. The system that should have shielded her did not. And in the end, it cost her her life. This point, the murder itself, represents the ultimate breakdown of accountability, a moment in which every prior failure led to irreversible consequences. It was not an isolated act of violence. It was the tragic fulfillment of a trajectory that had been visible for years. Aisha's murder wasn't shocking because it was unexpected. It was shocking because so many people had feared it would happen and no one had done enough to stop it. The aftermath of Aisha Fraser's murder exposed a chilling reality, not just the personal devastation of a woman lost to domestic violence, but a web of institutional failures that had long protected and empowered her killer. The shock and grief that followed Lance Mason's brutal act quickly transformed into widespread public outrage, particularly across Ohio, as citizens, activists, and officials began to scrutinize the systemic loopholes that had allowed him to remain in a position of trust and influence, despite his clear record of violent behavior. In the days and weeks following the murder, the narrative rapidly shifted from one focused solely on Mason's actions to one interrogating the institutions that had knowingly or unknowingly enabled them. The glaring question that dominated headlines and conversations was simple yet damning. How could a man who had been convicted of violently assaulting his wife, caught with an arsenal of weapons, and exposed as a danger to his family, be welcomed back into public life with such ease? The answer, many concluded, lay in the deeply embedded privilege Mason had been afforded, privilege that allowed him to slip through the cracks of accountability time and again. One of the most controversial revelations to emerge was the fact that Mason had received numerous character reference letters during his 2014 criminal case. These letters came not from distant acquaintances, but from high-ranking political and legal figures, including sitting judges, prosecutors, and even U.S. Congresswoman Marcia Fudge. These endorsements painted Mason as a man of integrity, deeply remorseful for his actions, and worthy of a second chance. Their tone minimized the severity of his crime, implying it was an isolated incident rather than a symptom of a more dangerous pattern of behavior. These letters were pivotal in securing Mason a lighter sentence and in softening the public image of his crime, especially within legal and political circles. But after the murder, those same letters were cast in a much darker light. What had once been seen as professional courtesy or institutional support now appeared complicit. Critics argued that such letters carried disproportionate weight in influencing the justice system, especially when written by those with authority or public trust. The fact that these recommendations came from people within the very system that was supposed to protect victims of abuse made the betrayal all the more stark. A system that claimed to prioritize justice had, instead, rallied around the abuser, not the woman he had brutalized. Perhaps even more disturbing was the fact that, following his release from prison after serving only 9 months, Lance Mason was hired by the city of Cleveland in a high-profile role. In 2017, just a few years after his conviction, he was appointed as the Director of Minority Business Development, a position that placed him in the public spotlight and allowed him to engage with community members, including many women and families. It was a government job that required a deep level of trust, responsibility, and public accountability. To place a convicted domestic abuser in such a role, many argued, was not only irresponsible, it was dangerous. This decision prompted intense backlash in the wake of Aisha's murder. People demanded to know who had authorized Mason's hiring and what vetting process, if any, had been conducted. City officials were forced to explain how a man with a felony conviction for a violent domestic assault had passed background checks and been deemed fit to serve in a public-facing, trust-based role. Cleveland Mayor Frank Jackson, who had hired Mason, faced sharp criticism for what many saw as a gross lapse in judgment. The hiring decision came to symbolize the larger issue of how systems of power often prioritize loyalty and connections over public safety and ethical integrity. Beyond the political fallout, the legal system itself came under renewed scrutiny. Judges and attorneys who had supported Mason were forced to defend their actions, while victims' advocates demanded stronger laws to prevent abusers from being reintegrated into positions of power without thorough psychological evaluations or community oversight. There were calls for more transparency in sentencing, stricter penalties for domestic violence offenders, and reforms to prevent character references from minimizing the true nature of violent crimes. The case also reinvigorated the national conversation about how privilege, especially when wrapped in gender, race, status, and political influence, can distort justice. Mason's social and political standing had granted him access to networks of protection that most abusers could never dream of. He was not just a man who had made a terrible mistake. He was a man who had repeatedly shown signs of violent, controlling behavior, and yet, he had been shielded by a system that chose to see him as a respected judge rather than a dangerous offender. That same system failed to protect Aisha Fraser, a Black woman, a teacher, a mother, even when she did everything within her power to follow the rules, report the abuse, and seek justice. In the broader cultural context, the murder also reignited discussions about how domestic violence is still minimized in legal and political arenas, particularly when the perpetrator is someone of influence. It revealed how rare it is for abusers to lose their professional stature, and how often survivors are the ones who must alter their lives, live in fear, and face social stigma. Aisha's death became emblematic of how society often values the redemption arc of the abuser over the safety and dignity of the abused. Ultimately, the aftermath of Aisha Fraser's murder laid bare the deep institutional rot at the heart of the systems designed to protect the vulnerable. It forced communities, leaders, and institutions to ask hard questions. How many warning signs must someone show before we take them seriously? How many lives must be shattered before systems stop prioritizing reputation over safety? And how long will society continue to offer second chances to abusers, while offering none to their victims? In response to public outcry, there were efforts to reevaluate how public institutions handle the reintegration of violent offenders and how domestic violence cases are prosecuted and monitored. But for many, those changes came far too late. Aisha Fraser was gone, and no policy reform or public apology could undo the damage caused by years of institutional negligence and misplaced loyalty. Her story became a call to action, not just to remember her, but to finally hold accountable the systems and people who helped enable her killer. The legacy of Aisha Fraser extends far beyond the tragedy of her brutal death. In life, she was a cherished mother, a devoted schoolteacher, and a beacon of compassion and leadership within her community. But in death, Aisha became something more, a symbol, a rallying cry, and a powerful catalyst for change. Her murder at the hands of Lance Mason did not merely reveal the horrors of domestic violence. It exposed how deeply broken the justice system can be when power, privilege, and institutional loyalty protect abusers rather than victims. And from that devastation, a movement was born, one determined to ensure that no one like Aisha would ever be so badly failed again. Aisha's friends, family, students, and colleagues mourned her loss with profound grief, but their mourning was soon paired with an urgent demand for justice and reform. To them, she was not simply a name in the news or a victim of a high-profile crime. She was a vibrant, generous, and intelligent woman whose life had been dedicated to uplifting others. Aisha had taught at Shaker Heights schools for many years and was beloved by generations of students and fellow educators alike. Her impact as a teacher extended far beyond academics. She helped shape lives, encouraged dreams, and served as a daily reminder of what strength, patience, and love looked like. The contrast between her public legacy and the private horror she endured at the hands of Mason shocked people into action. For years, Aisha had tried to move forward from her abusive marriage. She followed the law, worked with the courts, prioritized her daughter's well-being, and sought a peaceful path away from her abuser. Yet the system had failed to protect her at every step. That failure galvanized a growing chorus of voices determined to ensure that her life and death would not be forgotten, and that something good might still rise from the injustice she suffered. One of the first and most powerful responses came from the domestic violence advocacy community. Organizations across Ohio and the nation used Aisha's story to highlight the glaring gaps in protective measures for abuse survivors. Her case became a prime example of how charisma, influence, and institutional loyalty can blind authorities to danger, especially when the perpetrator is a man of stature. Lance Mason, after all, had once been a state senator and a respected judge. That prestige insulated him from proper scrutiny. His connections, including politicians who vouched for him during his trial, allowed him to maintain a public image that contradicted the private reality of his violent behavior. In response, activists began pushing for legislative reform, particularly aimed at holding public officials and individuals in positions of power more accountable for acts of domestic violence. Advocates argued that being a public servant should not protect someone from justice, it should demand higher standards. Many proposed laws that would bar convicted domestic abusers from holding public office or being employed in government roles, especially in community-facing positions. They also pushed for greater transparency in sentencing, stricter oversight when abusers are released from prison, and stricter protections for victims who share custody with their abuser. Aisha's murder also sparked community-led movements, including vigils, marches, and school-based memorials. At the schools where she had taught, students and colleagues created scholarships and memorials in her name. The Aisha Fraser Memorial Fund was established to support causes she cared about most: education, women's empowerment, and protections for victims of domestic violence. These gestures, while symbolic, also carried a practical message. Aisha was more than a victim. She was a leader, and her example would not be forgotten. Moreover, Aisha's name began appearing in discussions about the larger systemic patterns of abuse that go unnoticed or unpunished, especially in cases where the abuser is respected or powerful. Advocates and scholars emphasized how her story highlighted a recurring and deadly pattern. Survivors of abuse are often not believed or protected until it's too late. This message was repeated in speeches, workshops, and legislative hearings. Believe survivors the first time they cry for help became a central tenet of the movement Aisha's death inspired. For women of color in particular, Aisha's story resonated deeply. Many Black women have long experienced both systemic racism and gender-based violence, and their cries for help are frequently ignored or minimized. Aisha's murder demonstrated how these layers of neglect and invisibility can have fatal consequences. As her story spread, it helped fuel conversations about intersectionality in the domestic violence space, the idea that race, gender, and socioeconomic status often interact to determine how victims are treated by the system. Aisha's life, as a Black woman, a mother, and educator, forced communities and lawmakers to reckon with those compounded vulnerabilities and to recognize the urgent need for reforms that account for them. Even in popular culture and media, Aisha's story left an imprint. It was covered by national outlets like CNN, The New York Times, and domestic violence platforms, not just as a crime story, but as a case study in institutional complicity and societal failure. Her face and name became part of a growing list of women whose murders could have been prevented if the signs of abuse had been taken more seriously. The tragedy forced the public to confront a painful truth: that too often, systems only act after irreversible harm has already been done. But the legacy of Aisha Fraser is not just a cautionary tale. It is also one of resilience, community action, and the enduring power of memory. In the wake of her death, schools began implementing new domestic violence awareness curricula, support networks for educators were expanded, and survivor advocacy groups gained new momentum in lobbying for reforms. Her daughters, though forced to grow up without their mother, became surrounded by a community committed to protecting and uplifting them, not just as victims of trauma, but as survivors worthy of love, healing, and support. In the end, Aisha Fraser's legacy is a testament to both who she was and what she endured. Her life story is now inextricably linked to a broader push for justice, one that calls for not only punishing abusers, but dismantling the systemic protections that allow them to thrive. It is a reminder that change often comes at a heartbreaking cost, but that from that pain, movements can rise. Aisha did not die in vain. Her legacy lives on in classrooms, courtrooms, and every corner of society where someone dares to say, "Enough. No more. Not one more Aisha Fraser."